grade or at some distance below grade. So potential hazards with active and abandoned wells. There could be leaks due to inadequate plugging. That could be gases, oil, or something else. There could be gas accumulation under buildings or pavement. And with gas accumulations, there's a potential for explosions. There have been explosions around the country. I believe there was an explosion in the Hutchinson area some years ago, but there hasn't been a lot of occurrences of this, as I understand. There could be groundwater or surface water contamination from the fracking fluid or the oil. The other thing you see are the tank batteries. You see a lot of these around. These are not very attractive, but they're also vulnerable to lightning strikes. There was a strike and an explosion a few years ago, 2010, at 175th and Sunflower Road. I think the tank blew up and ended up in the road, and there was a big explosion. Some issues with abandoned wells. The Kansas Corporation Commission, their oversight is really not to address the safety of the well. That doesn't mean that they don't, through some of their regulations that they administer, they don't address that, but their emphasis really is for the efficient use of the resource and how the resource, to avoid conflicts of using the resource between well operators. Again, their emphasis is not on prevention of hazards. Plug wells are not necessarily monitored, so if they have leaks, we wouldn't know that. Current city regulations might not adequately protect land for future development. That's probably the biggest obvious concern, is the hindrance that wells place on future development. Consider that the city does have, in Title 15 of the code, not in zoning, but in Title 15, there is a section on oil and gas well permits. So if someone is required to get an oil and gas well permit, that part of the code is administered by Public Works. And there are standards in that section that address some of these issues. Long-range planning issues. Successful oil wells inside and outside the city are a major obstacle to planned residential growth. The reason I say successful oil wells is because if someone drills a bunch of wells and they actually produce a lot of oil, there's a lot of cash flow from those oil wells. Development for other purposes has to compete with that land use. So if you have a producing oil well that's doing very well, it's difficult for, say, residential development to come in and be a change of land use before that oil well has been expired. The other kind of obvious issue, or it might not be obvious here, but something we know about, Johnson County does not require any zoning permits for wells on parcels larger than 10 acres, at least in the zoning that surrounds Gardner. This is the rural county zoning. Most of the parcels are larger than 10 acres. A lot of the parcels are over 35 acres. All that is required is basically an electrical permit, so just a very minor permit at the county. What this means is when you look at that map, where you see all those oil wells that are right outside the city limits, if someone wants to install an oil well, we are not notified by the county. We do get some kind of notice from the KCC, but it's not a zoning permit per se. It's not really, it's not open to the type of process, comments, influence that, say, a conditional use permit or an land use entitlement would be open to. So we don't have the ability to influence what's happening in our planning area outside the city limits. We have very little ability to deal with that under current county zoning regulations. This is a map that's taken from the draft comprehensive plan, yet to be adopted, but this illustrates how oil wells are in the way of planned residential development. This map is in the residential areas plan of the draft comprehensive plan. That area that's in yellow, that's all planned for single-family residential growth or generally low-density residential development. As you can see, there are concentrations of oil wells in the path of that growth. There are concentrations of oil wells very close to city infrastructure. There are concentrations of oil wells right next to Celebration Park, right next to the Kill Creek wastewater treatment plant, and also very close to school facilities. So some potential solutions: require better well information for subdivision plat review. Prohibit buildings from being located over wells. Require sufficient setbacks for wells and tank batteries, and there are some setbacks in Title 15 for those. I think it's 200 feet per tank battery. Require greater assurance, such as physical requirements, performance bonding, that abandoned wells are plugged properly. There are some bonding requirements for deposits that are required. I'm not sure they are adequate currently. Require gas monitoring for buildings located near wells. And the last one on this page is get Johnson County to require a more inclusive permitting process for wells in the unincorporated area. And we haven't, at this point, we haven't made a huge effort to do that. I have spoken with the planning director about this, and that's something we can pursue. So with that, if you have any questions or comments, I'll take those, or Tim McKee will take those.
Questions for Mike? Christie, look like you have something.
Well, I guess one of the things that I thought that we would discuss is whether we, from a city perspective, we're going to allow, I mean, we've had a couple of permits come before us. One that was granted, then we denied the extension of it. So that's kind of where I thought the conversation was going, was what we felt from a city perspective we should require from permitting, allowing it.
Well, I can try to address that. Keep in mind, this work session is for the general issue of oil wells throughout the city. Currently, in the agricultural zoning district, oil wells are a conditional use. The intention, or the intent, the purpose of the agricultural district is not only to provide for agricultural uses, but also to provide for a transition to a higher intensity urban use, like housing. I think you could question whether oil wells should be a conditional use in the ag zone for that reason. I looked at the code. Oil wells are not expressly permitted. I say expressly. I didn't try to make an interpretation at this time, but are not expressly permitted in any other of the zones. But I think you could say that oil wells, given their life, which is probably at least 10 years, probably more like 20 years, they could be a hindrance to other forms of desirable development too. So I think it's a question whether they should be permitted in the city. There's some statutory things to think about, considerations. I'm not sure that the city, this is something that has to be looked at, whether the city can just outright prohibit oil wells in the city at all. I'm not sure that question's been answered yet, but that's certainly something that could be considered in the future.
Mike, what's the current policy for other Johnson County municipalities, like, for example, waiver limits? I mean, obviously, there's some, I couldn't say obviously. I think there may be situations where there is no guidance at all, but I would like to see if there's any current policies with any other municipalities that address new permits for wells within those city limits.
Yeah, and I don't know the answer to that. I believe in some cities they're prohibited. Someone told me that, but I haven't looked at that. I can certainly do that.
Where does the water come from for fracking? Is that through a municipal supply, or in the past I've heard in other areas of the country they truck it in. Of course, that might be in